Yeah. So I think a lot of things that may inhibit somebody from doing a lot of heavier overhead shoulder work would be overhead/shoulder work is the fact that they're already feeling a large amount of discomfort from something, which can, I agree with you 100% because I synced it. Most of it has to do most of the time with poor shoulder mechanics. They're not set up well, so they have to revisit some things. And so we talked about this, go back about 3 episodes, we talked about building a bigger, stronger back and how to do that and how the shoulders tie in here. And so I think that's a really good point you make, because if you're already starting from a weak platform with poor movement, and everything's rooted in movement here, right? And your ability to move well, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, it's well. Your inability to move well will then obviously translate up the chain or down the chain and could create issues. And those issues just might be weakness in areas you don't need or want weakness. It could be an irritation. It could be an injury. Again, I never like to make this about, don't do this because you'll get hurt. Like I don't like that. However, I will caution you on it because I synced it. Like you may wind up with those things. Now, here's another thing. If you're an athlete, you're somebody that's been super active your whole life, right? And you've been into stuff. Well, maybe you played contact sports. Maybe it was a non-contact sport or non-contact injury. But so many people have some level of shoulder injury that they've carried with them somewhere that was maybe a little bit more traumatic. I have 2 torn labrums. One, I know very specifically when I did it and how I did it. And the other one, I'm not exactly sure, but I know there were plenty of times where I fell, whether it was on the bike, in a scrap, because I've been in a few of those, on a field. Certainly I've separated my shoulders before on the football field. As big and strong as I was, I wound myself up in a situation where that thing was out and it quickly went back in, and you just kind of move on because you don't want to get pulled out of the game. Right. So those kind of things I think pop up. So I think people can relate to those. But you don't necessarily have had to have an acute injury to have some type of like a labral tear as an example, or some fraying of that biceps tendon, which is largely due probably to poor shoulder mechanics over time. It's just this constant wear and tear. It's like a good analogy would be like the alignment being off on your vehicle. On your car, and you look at the tire wear on your car, and all of a sudden you're looking at it, and it's what my dad would refer to it as cupping, right? Where one side of that tire is really worn down, doesn't have the same tread, to the extent that maybe the belt is starting to the wire belts in there are starting to kind of stick out a little bit. That's poor alignment. It's poor mechanics, right? At its very basic level, and what happens over time is it wears, right? Now you can operate like that for a long time until it can't anymore, right? Something comes up, you hit something, right? You run over something, or you just flat out wear it out. And obviously that could then mean catastrophic problems, right? Driving down the freeway and you see the tires coming off of the big rigs or the semis going down the road. That is just, you've worn through the tire cap that they put on those tires or whatever else, and it's gone, outside of it being a blowout.
Yeah, which I love that analogy for, especially something like the shoulder. I feel like, the shoulder is very, very complex in these mechanics that need to go on, that there needs to be this like synergistic movement of and engagement of a lot of the tissue. So that's how I kind of explain a lot of people, like, when they're like, oh, I have a rotator cuff injury. Well, do you really have a rotator cuff injury, or was your rotator cuff maybe doing too much of the work because of your poor shoulder mechanics? So yes, there's time to strengthen the rotator cuff or strengthen the things that help stabilize the shoulder overhead. But what's your scap control look like? What are the other big stabilizers around the shoulder doing? And what does that look like to help you get a more, I guess we'll say, optimal movement pattern that doesn't wear the tread as much as you in the same instance. So it's interesting though, because we've talked about, I think a lot of people have this like injury or this issue or pain. And so a lot of people throw in the towel with overhead. They avoid it, which that's never going to get you there. And we've talked about, until you have to go grab your luggage when you're on the airplane and you can't get overhead and you have no strength or ability to do that. Like, you need to be able to do that to some capacity, but it's finding the right dosage and the right exercise for you, which that's where working with a coach or really feeling out. But overhead is very relative, right? Even when we were talking through like the athletes overhead, there is a strict standing overhead press, which is in a full, shoulder flexion and extension and thoracic extension and in that position. But then it's a very wide spectrum. So you'll see like in a lot of our programs where we kind of titrate getting you slightly more and more overhead. So maybe you're on like a low incline press, then you go to a higher incline press, and you go to a higher incline press, or you're working with a landmine, or you're working with a kettlebell. And we've talked about some of those different mechanics, but titrating to see where you are still building strength, capacity, and muscle in, but that you don't get these big issues or pain or an inflammatory response every time you do it, things like that.
Yeah, so you have to find the thresholds, and at the same time, if you treat your body like it's a fragile thing, then that's exactly what you're going to be, is a fragile thing. So that's a really good place to kind of jump off from, and that is basically on the overall perspective of stability. And stability comes with proper mechanics and building strength around the thing that you are trying to train. So I always give like the diving board analogy as one of those things. So you got your diving boards attached to the side of the pool, right? So it's got a base on it, and then that's cantilevered out over the board's on top, and it's cantilevered out over the pool. Mm-hmm. And at that base, you've got, let's say, 4 bolts holding it to the pool deck, right? And then you have your platform, and it may have different stiffnesses or lengths or whatever, and that changes the physics and the mechanics, how much flexy and bouncy you have on that thing, right? But that's where your force generation comes from. And so then you get the 150-pound diver on there, or person partying at the pool. They get out there and they bounce and get a little flex in that thing. They spring up into the air and they dive or cannonball or whatever into the pool. Well, that looks a little different. The board looks a little different, right? And the force production is a little different when you get the 250-pound person that's that. And you put the 350-pound person out there, and obviously that's it. That's an issue, or that changes things too, and could be an issue for how the diving board is performing and how stable it needs to be. Yeah. So let's go back to that base with those 4 bolts. Let's say you got one of those bolts that's kind of backing out. Either it's coming out of the concrete, or that nut gets loose on the top, and you have a little wiggling, you have a little wobbling, right? So basically what you have is a little instability. Mm-hmm. And that instability, going back to the 150, 250, and 350-pound, diver right on there, that's going to create that translates back to the board, down into the base, and then down to that very weak spot, and it just starts wearing away. And over time, a couple of things can happen. Maybe what it will do is it'll make those other 3 bolts in that base have to work that much harder, right? And they probably will, and they'll probably do a good job on it until they can't anymore, until that 350-pound diver keeps hitting that board over and over and over, and then maybe one of those other ones starts to back out. Yeah. And I think you see where I'm going with this. Basically, what you're doing is you're getting instability over time. That changes the mechanics of what's going out at the very end of that board where the person is actually bouncing, and it gets translated back, and everything in between is impacted. Also, everything in between gets less force production as there's less stability. Yes, yep. So if you're trying to just pile on load to your overhead shoulder press, and you have points or a point of instability and or lack of strength and poor mechanics, again, the mechanics of the diving board should be rock solid to that pool deck. If it's not, everything else is kind of null and void. Yeah, it's going to be compromised. So if you think about it that way and how you're lifting, you could apply this to all the things, right? But if you think about that, like the stability is the most important place to start. So, and that becomes with building a bigger, stronger body down low and not leaving anything off the table. All right. So moving from there, let's assume our diving board and our diving board platform is strong and stable. And we've done a good job at securing that thing. We read the instructions. We had a professional install it, right? And we've been caring and maintaining for that thing for quite some time. That is our body now, right?